The war in Ukraine impacts all of us in some form or fashion here in the United States, whether it's higher grocery prices at the store, fuel prices, or other things that we deal with. But we're not the only ones. Our European neighbors, they also deal with lots of things as well as after effects of the Ukraine war. And they are also dealing with some unexpected effects as well. And what are their perceptions of the war that's currently going underway? I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV, and we're striving to get some more answers for you today. With me today are two researchers from Germany to help us understand this better. So Dr. Heiko Biehl, nice to meet you. You're here with us. And also Dr. Timo Graf. They're both with the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences in Germany. So thank you for traveling to come see us today. And so what sparked your interest in this area of study, first of all?
Well, we are the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences, and it's all in the name. You know, we are part of the Bundeswehr, that is part of the German Armed Forces. We are a center, meaning we are a research center. And we have two branches, you can say, military history. It's all about Second World War, Cold War, and also the missions abroad since 1990, and also social sciences. And two of us, we are military sociologists, so the two of us are belonging to military sociology and the social science branch. Yeah.
Right, and so you also are veterans too. So what unique perspectives does that give you in your research area?
Well, the point here is that if you look to Germany, but also to other countries, there's not much research on the military going on for the last decades. It changed a little bit with the war in Ukraine, which is really next door to Germany, and we can really have instruments which are unique in the field. For example, you have an annual public opinion poll, what Germans think about the armed forces and so on, and we can also approach the armed forces and do service inside the armed forces. It's a privilege for us. We are the only ones who can do this kind of studies, and therefore we are the go-to research institute for this kind of research in Germany.
And go ahead, Timo.
I just wanted to add, you asked first question, what brings you to the field? What's your interest in public perceptions of the war in Ukraine right now? So really, on behalf of the MOD, I run the largest population survey in Germany precisely on these issues. The war in Ukraine, our perception of the US as a reliable NATO ally, but also, questions on China, how stable people think NATO is, how much we should spend on defense, etc., etc. It's really the go-to reference. If you want to know what the German people think about all these issues, it's the #1 survey in Germany. That's also reflected in the media coverage that we get. More than 100 reports a year. So it's actually my job. My entire position is writing on that project. So. And it's for the MOD. So we brief the military leadership, we brief the political leadership on these issues, and we also advise them on how to adjust communications. So not on a day-to-day basis, but occasionally you would have workshops and sit together and figure out, what narrative there should be, and what we should pursue in terms of strategic communications, narratives, etc. So that's our day-to-day business, really.
And I'm sure it's familiar terms for you, but MODs, explain what the MOD is.
It's the Federal Ministry of Defense.
Got it. Cool. No, that's okay. We just want to make sure everybody
knows.
Absolutely. So that's
right.
all good. So you bring up, the perception is important to talk about, and then the military sociology. So those two areas, why do you think studying those is more important now than ever?
Yeah, it was important always, but now, of course, with the war in Ukraine, war is back in Europe again. I'm not sure if everybody is familiar with this kind of thing. It's an interstate war. It's not this kind of asymmetric warfare that we've seen in Afghanistan over the last 2 decades. I mean, Timo, you've got just the numbers. How many soldiers are fallen in Ukraine? It's tremendous,
Yeah, just to put things into perspective, okay? Yeah. So when you take a look at U.S. soldiers that have fallen in Vietnam, the first Iraq war, the second Iraq war, and also in Afghanistan, okay? So these are large wars, right? No one can argue that, right? Especially Vietnam. And if you add up those numbers, you will have roughly 70,000 fallen US soldiers. And what the Russians are suffering right now in Ukraine, right, over just the course of 2 years, is, estimates are wild right now, but it's anywhere between 70 and 120,000 fallen Russian soldiers, right? Just to put things into perspective. And during 20 years of the war in Afghanistan, right, the US lost around 2,500 soldiers, right? That rate of attrition in Ukraine, you will have that in 2 days.
Yeah.
So 20 years of Afghanistan is equivalent to 2 days of Russian losses in Ukraine, right? The Ukrainian figures are notoriously hard to get, right? They do a good job in keeping that a secret, but they will have also anything between 300 to 600 a day.
Wow.
Right? Those are huge losses, right? Just to put things into perspective.
Yeah.
Now, how do you typically gather those numbers? Do you have people on the ground you rely on to tell you, I've looked at lists of casualties and this is what we have, or do you have, what's the process involved, Timo?
Well, like I said, like the estimates are wild, so for the Russians, 70 to 120,000, right? You can see nobody's got the real numbers, okay? And the Ukrainians are making their casualties state secret, if you will. So the numbers that we have, these are just open source intelligence, that's what we gather. So we don't actually have people on the ground, okay? We're not the military intelligence service or anything, right? And they certainly don't share their numbers with us. I mean, they will keep a tally of their own, but they're not sharing that information with us. Absolutely. This is also not our job. It's just to put things into perspective and to remind ourselves how huge this war actually is.
Right, and then to talk about the perception factor, how much more difficult is it to talk with people and to say, judge what their perception is when there's no clear picture of what really is happening? I mean, if the numbers are wildly varying.
Well, the war started in early 22, and from then on you could really see it was, the German term is Zeitenwende, meaning it's an epochal turn. So, of course, the situation on the ground is not really clear, but this issue is on the front page in Germany since 2.5 years. People are really talking and worrying about the war from different perspectives and different issues and different positions, but it's really there. It's not a byproduct of daily news or something. It's really in the center of attention. And we also took, as Germany as a country, took bold actions after the full-scale Russian invasion. For example, we spent extra money for our armed forces of 100 billion euro. To also put this into perspective, it's double. We spend every year on the armed forces 50 billion, so it's more than 2 annual what we spend on the armed forces in 2 years. So just to give it in perspective, it was really a game changer in 2022. And everyone on the street is really concerned about this war and having different positions. That's our job to do public opinion polls. Yeah.
So really, this historical turn in Germany's defense policy since 2022, there are 3 pillars to it, I would say. The first one is that usually, like back in the days, for decades, even during the Cold War, Germans, they pursued this policy of rapprochement with Russia, right? We would always want to try and negotiate with the Russians, right? But we did so during the Cold War from a position of strength, right? Let's not forget that. Because these days, a lot of folks, they argue that we should negotiate with Russia again because apparently Russia can't be defeated on the battlefield. So there must be a political solution to this whole war, right? But what these people forget is during the Cold War, we wanted to talk to Russia from a position of strength, right? Right now, we're not in a position of strength when you just look at European defense capabilities, right? Excluding the US for second tier. So, but this has totally changed, like we have new strategic documents that say out loud, Russia is the largest threat to our security, and it resonates with the people. What they see on the news every day, right? They understand. They're not reading strategic documents, right? But just from what they see on the news, they understand Russia is a real threat. Back in the days, we had a very ambivalent Russia image in the German population.
Absolutely.
1/3 would say, okay, it's a threat, Russia. 1/3 would say like, I don't know exactly what Russia is, right? And 1/3 would argue like, okay, Russia's our friend and we can do business with Russia, right? That has changed radically, okay? Now you have like 65% of Germans, like an absolute majority, solid absolute majority, that say Russia is a threat in more than one way, right? And we should not do any business at all with Russia. And also culturally, we have nothing in common with the Russians, right? So that's pillar number 1, the changing threat perception, right? The second one is that we understand that if we're faced with this we have to say so, existential threat, right? Russia will not stop in Ukraine. We all know that, right? And that's what we got to prepare for. So we spend a lot more money on defense than we used to, a lot more, right? So for Germany, it's a big deal, and the rest of Europe is doing the same. Just look at the Polish. They spend more than the US in terms of GDP, right? On defense, right? They're approaching 5% almost, right? So all of Europe is spending more on defense. And the third pillar is that we're returning to large-scale territorial warfare, right? Back in the days, meaning from the 1990s up till the end of the war in Afghanistan, we would only have peacekeeping forces, you know, very light footprint, a couple armored vehicles, right? But no heavy artillery, no strategic airlift, no emphasis on cruise missiles or defense or anything on that, right? And these three pillars, right? Russia is a threat, the need to spend more on defense, and thirdly, to go back to defense. Peer sort of warfare, right, with a peer adversary like Russia, right? Those three pillars, they're all supported by the German people. And that has never been the case. And now they support policy. So public perception and policy, for the moment being, they are in line.
Now, they're in line with policy, but what about trust of the military? From what we've seen that's been a concern, and that obviously you're studying that.
Yeah.
How do the German people feel about what will happen with the German military carrying out the needed actions?
Absolutely. That's the core field of our research, actually. And you have to say there's some misperception in the field, in the academic field, in literature, but also in the public, and especially in the armed forces. If you talk to the common German soldier, he would say, well, we don't have enough societal or political support. But if you just look at the numbers that we gain in public opinion polls, and we're doing this for almost 3 decades, you can see that the armed forces were one of the public institutions with the highest trust. Yeah, and people said, well, you can trust the armed forces. Roughly about 3/4 to 80% or even more said, well, we have trust in the armed forces. Only the police and some others like public schools, etc., are coming near this value. So you can say there's a big trust. But nevertheless, in the German public, and especially in the armed forces, they don't feel that they have this trust. So we are looking for reasons why is that. But if you look into more detail, for example, there are also concerns in the public. For example, especially given with the war next door, if you ask people, is the German military well equipped? What's about armament, ammunition, etc.? Only a small minority said, well, we are ready to defend and to deter the Russian aggression. So in this regard, there's not much trust, but not in the armed force, but in their equipment. So you have to really differentiate between these two layers. Yeah.
Right, so a lot of finer points.
But I would like to add something to that. You know, like we just said, like for the past quarter century, public opinion regarding the armed forces as such, right? The public image of the armed forces hasn't changed much, and it's been very positive, right? Okay, so there has been no historical turning point regarding that, right? Okay, but I think where change is happening is elsewhere, okay? Because back in the days when our troops, you know, were like peacekeeping troops in Kosovo, in Afghanistan, also in Mali lately, right? People didn't like these missions. You know, they didn't understand what they were there for. So they had a positive image of the military, you know, in abstract terms, like, yeah, we trust the military. Yeah, the military is doing a great job. But really, what those politicians, what the government is using the military for, we don't really agree with that, right? And that created a lot of tension between the soldiers, a lot of them going on these missions, right? Returning back home and getting no respect and no credit for what they did overseas, you know? So that created a lot of tension. And I think now all these missions are over, right? No more Afghanistan, no more Mali, none of that, right? And we're returning to territorial defense. And that is something people can get behind. They understand the logic of it, you know? They understand that Russia is a threat, and the Bundeswehr is there to protect us, the German taxpayer. They're not doing some weird stuff over there in Mali that we don't understand and we don't know what it's good for. They're on the eastern flank, and they protect us German taxpayers. And they do understand that. And I think in those terms, I think we're entering a new phase when it comes to civil-military relations. That is, not only does the Bundeswehr continue to enjoy a very positive image with the people, but now people can also get behind their mission. And that's going to be a new phase in civil military relations in Germany, I think.
And one we'll definitely talk about a little bit more here in just a second. If you're just tuning in and joining us, I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs, and with me today, Dr. Heiko Biehl and Dr. Timo Graf. They're researchers with the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences. Again, the Deutschland, they're very concerned about protecting that. What about perceptions about the Germans' thoughts on the United States? And of course, we've seen through military history, media portrayals of the German military and how those have changed over time. What effects have you noticed in your research about Germany's and United States, Germans' thoughts on the United States military?
Perhaps first of all, I would like to say that Germany is the most important military partner for the German armed forces and also for Germany as such. So we have two pillars of security and defense policy in Germany and all over Europe. The one is NATO, led by the US, and the other is the European Union. But NATO is much more important, especially given with all the military might that the US has. And you look at the public image, you can see that especially after the Russian attack on Ukraine in 2022, the people are much more aware of the importance of NATO and of US backing our security situation. So there are the majority of the German people trust in the US and want reliable common defense efforts. There are, of course, like in every democracy, there are some other voices, but mostly on the fringes of the political spectrum on the right-hand side and on the left-hand side. But most people trust in the US and want the US as the strongest partner of German security and defense policy.
And shifting gears a little bit, let's talk about the transformation. The Bundeswehr has sort of transformed their military, I guess, their look, and there's some, like even their slogan, right, that has changed over the years compared to, and then it's an all-volunteer force in 2011, so similar to what we have in the United States. So some similarities between how the military operates, but again, some changes too to help with the perception, of course, with actually doing things too.
I mean, the Bundeswehr was founded in '55 at during the Cold War, and it was only focused on territorial and collective defense until '99, with a strong conscription army. Everybody was drafted, and that changed after '90. We went from territorial defense to international missions in contexts like Afghanistan or in Africa, and now 2022 is really a game changer again. And we need new equipment, we need new organization, we need new doctrine. What we didn't reintroduce actually is a conscription. There's some talk going on in the public sphere about reintroducing conscription, because only with conscription you can gain enough people and get enough people to really fill the ranks. But nevertheless, until now, there's not a political decision to do this, and a little bit of the political power is missing, and they don't want to take this bold action, although it's perhaps necessary, just seen from a purely military angle.
But I would just like to add, that there's strong public support for reintroducing conscription in Germany. Like the people really see the point of it. They understand that the Bundeswehr, as it is today, right, with its 180,000 soldiers, active soldiers, at present, it's just not going to be enough, right? It's just not going to be enough.
Absolutely.
Just in terms of the size of it, I wanted to say sheer size of it, but it's really not that big, right? It's not that impressive. And the people understand, conscription might be necessary, right? Not just to fill the ranks, but to really grow an adequate size, And I take it, people are not just willing to spend more on defense, they're actually willing to do their part, We also take a look at the younger folks, right? So 16 to 29, right? It would be their turn, right? Okay, it's nice to have old folks say like, yeah, back in the days, this is also what I did, and now it's their turn, fair enough. But when you take a look at the younger people, you have a lot of undecided folks, like around a quarter. They're undecided, they don't know what to think of it, and really we're discussing various models right now, so it's just fair for them to lean back and watch how the whole debate unfolds. Depending on the model, they might either vote for or against it. But then you have a relative majority of just over 40% that say yes, regardless of the model, I'm willing to do my part, and I find that remarkable.
And when you compare Germany to its neighbor, you have very different decisions or situations in Europe. For example, you have some countries who shifted from the conscription army of the Cold War to an all-volunteer force, for example, like we did and the French did. On the other hand, you had some countries like Finland or Austria, our neighbors, who never gave up a conscription, who drafted all the time, all the decades, all young male people, and other countries like Sweden or Lithuania, they even reintroduced already the conscription. And you can see that it's really a change going on in our defense environment there with our neighbors. And just to give you the numbers, Timo already mentioned, at the moment we have 180,000 soldiers. During the height of the Cold War, we had 500,000. So that's really only in West Germany. The East Germans had their own armed forces. Only in just West Germany, Bundeswehr was 500,000 people. That's quite a difference, right?
Right. Now, what about women in combat roles in the Bundeswehr?
No problem. We are open. Every rank, every branch, every service is open for women. Currently, we have a little bit over 13% of the armed forces are female. Lots of them serving in the medical branch, but we also have young women serving with the parachuters, with tank units, submarines, and every kind of this. So we are open, but up until now, mostly male armed forces, like most of the armed forces in the Western world.
And the Bundeswehr, just again, when we say Bundeswehr, we're talking about German military forces.
Yeah, exactly.
What do we include? We have, as you mentioned, parachutists, so air and land. So if you could just elaborate for folks who may not be familiar with the Bundeswehr.
Of course. Traditionally, the German armed forces are mostly land focused. So the army is the strongest branch of the Bundeswehr, of the German armed forces. We have a Navy who's now again focused just on the waters close by close by Germany, like in the Baltic Sea and in the North Sea. So it's their territory of maneuver, and we have an Air Force now who's really partnering with the Europeans and with the U.S. force. And we also have some we are starting like you did in the U.S., like cyber force and so, but that's very first step. If you think about the German armed forces, if you just look on the map, you see we are more or less landlocked country, and we are very focused on the army.
On the land, right. Now, what about military leadership? Obviously, when the Bundeswehr was started in 1955, it was a certain way. How has that military leadership style evolved over time? And can you explain that a little bit?
Yeah, that's fascinating, because after the Second World War, for 10 years, Germany didn't have any armed forces because we lost the war. And we not only lost the war, but all the strategy and all this crime which we committed during the Second World War. And we restarted it again, especially with American help after the Second World War. And the kind of leadership, there was a big debate in Germany and still going on, which kind of leadership and which kind of soldier identity would you like? And there are more or less two options. The first one is to be a citizen soldier, to be really integrated not only in the armed forces, but also be part of civilian society. And that's the German model after the Second World War. And that's our image, what we try to aim again. And the other option was to be isolated, to be just warrior-minded, don't care about what civilian society thinks about the armed force. And that's a taboo in Germany, and we don't want to go again along this road, but we want to be, it's special term is innere Führung, doesn't matter, but it's about being integrated, being part of civilian society, have close relationship with civilian counterparts.
Yeah. But what I noticed, just by reading publications from the Bundeswehr, and also certain strategy documents, speeches given by the highest military leadership, also some politicians, in fact, they use a different kind of rhetoric these days, also when they describe soldiers' roles, so you have a little bit of the warrior coming back, and the emphasis being put on fighting war again, with what's going on in Ukraine. Because back in the, like for 30 years, the ideal type was the peacekeeper, the soldier as a peacekeeper and global street worker, right? Being open to different cultures, being very sensitive and strong in terms of communication and all these things, right? But not so much about fighting, right? And these days, when you read those speeches, when you read those documents, they more and more put an emphasis on fighting war, being ready for war.
Be ready for fighting wars.
Yeah, exactly. So you just have to literally grab your backpack, grab your rifle, and be ready to go to war, right? That's what they emphasize these days. And I think in that sense, it's not officially shifting, but it's just an adaptation, Like we see what's going on in Ukraine, and it's not the peacekeeper right now. It's going to keep Europe safe.
And that brings me to the question, what if, and as a hypothetical, what if Russia were to win the war in Ukraine? How would that affect that leadership style that we were just discussing, do you think?
I think, it's a what-if question, but I would say that the most important thing is that as NATO we stand together and can really deter further Russian aggression. And that meaning that we are now supporting Ukraine on a really broad basis. Just to give you an impression, for example, there are a lot of refugees from the Ukraine now living in Germany, more than 1 million people, etc. And I think it's really necessary to stand together as NATO partners, as European partners, and deter Russia already in Ukraine, but also along the eastern border. And for example, our partners in the Baltic, like Estonia and others, they really want some support, and Germany is actually providing some of this support.
Just to add to that, I think you asked this what if question, and we're social scientists. We research what is. So we're empirical scientists, and we don't want to speculate, right? But just if we had to imagine for a second, Ukraine would lose this war, whatever that would look like, okay, be it a frozen conflict with Russia keeping what they conquered in the Donetsk and Luhansk Oblasts in Ukraine, or they will even go further. But the thing is, if Russia's going to win this war one way or another, right, they will be closer to NATO borders, and they will be more of a threat than they are right now, as they are still bogged down in Ukraine, right? So I think as they come closer to our borders, right, the more we will also have to get ready for war. Like, this is literally what our minister said. Is that we need to prepare ourselves for a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia, the latest by 2029, right? And most likely it's going to happen before that date, right? And this is not just some worst case scenario. This is what they expect, given the intel and the knowledge that they have right now.
And
okay,
what they communicate publicly,
and what they now communicate publicly, So this is this is the expectations we're dealing with, right? And so I think, how will the leadership? I don't know about leadership style, but in terms of the identity of the soldiers, the warrior is going to come back.
Mm-hmm. And you bring up the partnerships through NATO, how important those are, obviously, were that to happen, obviously vital, and as we are right now, how important do you think those partnerships are with NATO?
This is vital. I mean, we have a common defense, and it's only reliable if every partner stands by the other. So we pay a lot of political capital to take the Europeans and keep the European countries together. I mean, you have to keep in mind that NATO is 30-something countries, and everyone has its own interests, and it's really hard to bring them together, but it's really necessary. And up until now, it still works in NATO. It works in the European Union, but that is really, I think, it's a decisive point from a strategic, seen from a strategic level. And obviously, it's a Russian intention to split us up. They are providing misinformation. They are trying to influence elections all over Europe. They are supporting parties who are critical of NATO and more sympathetic to Russia. So that's really, I think that's the end game of the Russian strategy, to split up Europe and to split up the Western alliances. And we have to be aware of this and stay together.
Yeah, I totally agree with Heiko. I think, NATO won't be defeated on the battlefield. Okay, certainly not by the Russians. So and the Russians know that as well. Okay, so the game they play really is to divide us, to split us apart, because they know if we continue to stand together, right, and if we pool our resources, right, you know, deterrence works. But if Russia manages, you know, to exploit whatever differences we might have, right, and publicly, right, after all, you need to remember, you know, NATO with its Article 5 sort of mutual defense clause, it's not an automatism, okay? There's no real protocol to follow here, okay? So every country chips in whatever they're happy with, right? So that's also why a lot of NATO countries did not contribute anything or very small numbers of troops to what was going on in Afghanistan, right? After all, it was the US for the first time in NATO's history declaring an Article 5 scenario, right? And it was the Germans who answered the call by contributing the most troops, right? So we need to keep that in mind. And but really, it's only built on trust, you know? NATO is entirely built on trust. And once you start eroding that trust, right, that's where the Russians will defeat us.
Before we, and I have a related question, before we do that, in case anybody's just tuning in, I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV. I'm speaking with Dr. Timo Graf and Dr. Heiko Biehl. They're with the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences. And we're talking about the dynamics of the NATO partnership, how vital that is, regardless of what happens in Ukraine. And you bring up how, obviously, leadership, political forces in Germany are at play. Some are Russian friendly. And so we have the AfD, who again, that's the alternative for Germany, which is on the right, and then with the BSW, and then we have, of course, how does that all play into this? And I know you're watching that closely too.
Now it comes to party politics. You have to keep in mind that Germany is a federal system where we have elections not only on the federal level but also on the state level. And we had some elections 2 weeks ago, I think. And you could see that the parties which were more friendly to the Russian side and were strengthened by the elections and were winners of the election. But now there's a certain dynamic in the German public going on, and we will see what comes out. But the point here is that nowadays you have first discussions about how will this war end, and shouldn't we go as Timo already said, shouldn't we try to prepare negotiations, find more diplomatic solutions, and so on? And there's still debate, and well, we don't know what's coming out. You have to keep in mind that we have general elections in Germany in the September of next year.
So coming up soon.
And I think it's important to keep in mind, you know, you just brought up these elections that we had a couple of weeks ago. They took place in the east of Germany, right, in 2 eastern states. And really the mindsets of East Germans and West Germans, especially when it comes to issues how to deal with Russia, how to deal with NATO, the US, etc. I wouldn't say they're worlds apart, but there are certain differences, right? So in the East, they have this mindset of being very critical of the US. They're still not overly fond of NATO, right? They're very critical of Germany's aid to Ukraine, especially weapons deliveries, right? And they are more Russia-friendly than in the West, right? And so when you say the BSW, so like neo-communist but also very nationalistic and anti-immigrant, right? And the AfD being outright right-wing parties, they're pro-Kremlin, you know. They're anti-US, they're anti-globalization, they're anti-NATO, anti-EU, and these are pro-Kremlin parties. I mean, what they say, you know, in the public about Ukraine, about Russia and the US, you know, this is outright Moscow's propaganda. You know, and these are very dangerous forces. Again, you know, we won't be defeated on the battlefield, but it's forces like this that, you know, divide our society, right? And that can bring it all down.
Yeah, misinformation, and then it sounds like we have a lot of that, and then again, political forces trying to make cracks in the foundation, the 3 pillars, the things we talked about. That sounds like the big concern there. So one more quick question with you all about the turning point, and I'm not going to try to say the Zeitenwende, how that has been a part of your studies too, and what that has to do with the long-lasting effects on Germany's military?
Well, that's really, first of all, it was an epochal turn. Yeah, it was really a turning point. And I remember that when we woke up in February 2022, and there came no information that Russia really started its full-fledged attack on Ukraine. It was a surprise for lots of us. And I mean, it shouldn't be, because Russia already invaded Ukraine in 2014, and we have, our historian colleagues have to go into in-depth studies and look why we had so much misperception about this conflict, because our eastern neighbors, we had to admit, always said, be careful of Russia, like the Poles or the Baltic states, and well, especially Germany, even after 2014, still did a lot, or had a lot of relations to Russia, especially in economic terms, and the delivery of gas went on and on and on, and great dependency of on Russia by energy standards. So, well, it was a turning point, and it was like the fall of the wall in Berlin in '89 or so. Mm-hmm. You could really see it, and what came out of it is still open. I'm not sure. Until now, it's not decided.
Yeah, I'm a little bit pessimistic when it comes to how lasting this historical turn in Germany's defense policy, also public opinion, might ultimately be. That is because it's driven by the perception of threat, first and foremost. We did some serious research on that. We published that, the main driver of the change in policy and public opinion is the threat perception of Russia, right? And if we are to imagine that, peace conferences are being prepared, right, and everybody will want to negotiate some end to this conflict, right, then threat perceptions, I promise you, they will come down to levels such that there will no longer be majority support for greater defense spending or an active defense of NATO's eastern flank. Immediately attention, both by the politicians, by the government, and also by the normal people, will turn away from this conflict, and it might all be over relatively quickly. So I don't think it runs that deep. It's changes in policy and people's attitude towards these policies. But I don't think that it's a real game changer in terms of, say, Germany's strategic culture, something that is more fundamental, I don't think that these tectonic shifts are happening right now. It's all rather superficial, and it can be over relatively quickly.
Very good insights, and thank you so much for your time. We're out of time, but thank you, Dr. Heiko Biehl, Dr. Timo Graf. Thank you so much for joining us all the way from Germany, from the Bundeswehr Center for Military History and Social Sciences. And I'm Micah Terrell with 91.9 Public Affairs and APSU-TV.